Hello and welcome to the Franchise Tag Fantasy Show recap. Today we are on to the wide receivers, the one we've all been looking forward to, the big one, what I feel is the new fantasy player, not those running backs anymore. And as always, we're proudly sponsored by 888 Sport, the home of betting for the NFL in UK and Ireland. And remember, guys, always be gamble aware and 18 plus only. Adam, the wide receivers, we're on it. And as always, I've got a little bit of something special before we get going, before we get into those players. I've got a bet for you, as you're our betting guy. Here it is. You probably can't see it. So, as always, you probably were expecting this. We've done quarterback passing yards for the quarterbacks. We've done rushing yards for the running backs. So, with only 2 games left, we're doing receiving yards for those wide receivers. And Jamar Chase is sat at the top at 7-4. And Deebo Samuel, who's currently leading, isn't he? The receiving yards for the people that are left in it, isn't he?
I've no idea whatsoever.
So I think we've got, CeeDee Lamb out, was leading. Then Deebo Samuel has 178 yards to Jamar Chase's 145 yards. So they're the 2 guys at the top of the list. Do you see it being one of those 2 guys? We've got George Kittle and Travis Kelce, 2 tight ends nipping at the heels, and then AJ Brown, Devonta Smith, Brandon Ayuk. What are you saying?
Jamar Chase.
You think he can?
I know it's boring. I know it's boring because it's the favourite. I completely get that. Jamar Chase will win this award. He's only, what did you say, 30 yards behind Samuel? Something like that?
Yes.
Yeah. He's going up against Kansas City. And as we said over and over again in the betting show, they are 32nd against giving up passing touchdowns. They are pretty bad against giving up passing yards. Obviously, that was during the season. But to be honest, I feel like you saw last week with Jacksonville. I know Jacksonville didn't score loads of points, but I felt like Christian Kirk had a pretty decent game. I felt that Evan Ingram had a relatively okay game. They are a team that you are going to be able to score on, and you are going to be able to give up get yards against them even. And so, yeah, Jamar Chase 7-4. Also think they're going to win, and if they win, it means they've got another game. So I think at 7-4, it's a good shout for Chase, who, let's face it, we said when we did this for the quarterbacks about Joe Burrow and how we liked Joe Burrow, his number 1 read every time is Jamar Chase. And so I think that 7-4 it's a decent price. It's not fantastic. It's not anything massive. I don't see anything else that is really sort of coming out at me as something amazing. I think obviously Deebo is going to be around and is currently leading, so that's one that you could look for. But Kelce, Kittle, I just don't think they're going to get the yards in order to be able to do anything. So yeah, Chase for me.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up the point that I was going to say there 3 weeks ago when we were talking quarterbacks. Our favourite and our best odds we thought was Joe Burrow to win the most passing yards for the playoffs at 6-1, I believe we clocked it at.
Only 6-5 now, isn't he? Come on.
Yeah. So I think we were quite accurate about that. He's got Brock Purdy to trump, hasn't he? Brock Purdy's we didn't even look at the odds for Brock Purdy to win it.
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Purdy's going to be passing the ball off and all that, and that's it. Joe Burrow, he's going to have loads of time against them Chiefs cornerbacks. Nice big over the top plays. Even in the snow. See, it doesn't matter. Even in the snow, he loves to throw the ball. It's going to happen.
So
hey, you told us that the odds don't lie. I'm just saying, I think that 6-1 lied a little bit. So
last week we said Christian McCaffrey. Obviously, his odds have now shortened. So if you listened to the show last week and you got on it, you got the better odds. Don't miss out on this as well with Jamar Chase. 7-4 at the moment. After this week, they're going to be either evens or 6-4 or something like that. So don't miss this one. If you missed the Christian McCaffrey, don't miss this one. If you missed the Joe Burrow one, then we can't really tell you much more than tune in to every show. Adam, let's get into it. Let's talk about these wide receivers for the fantasy season. Let's go right in, as we've always started with this, with the best valued wide receiver this year.
Yeah, so there was a few. As I've said for the other ones, I kind of feel like with best value, you have to go for someone who has made a big impact on your team as well. I think that's the only, logical thing that you could go for here. There was a few that I kind of like the look of. I thought Devonta Smith was a very good value this year. I thought that Christian Kirk as well was also a very good value. However, the one that I went for in the end, and I mean, we are very, very bad, all of us fantasy players, who disrespect this guy every year. And every year, is it the same guy? Every year it comes out as the same. He was drafted as the wide receiver 45, which was the bottom of the 9th, which is insane when you think about it. Finished as the wide receiver 15 with 979 yards and 8 touchdowns. Tyler Lockett.
Not the same guy.
Oh, not the same guy. Okay. Tyler Lockett, I think, as a value, I mean, it is. We are awful at this. Every year it's the same thing. We always disrespect Tyler Lockett. We don't pick him up. And it doesn't matter who's there, Russell Wilson, Geno Smith. It's irrelevant because he still performs. And he actually performed better than DK Metcalf. I think Metcalf was 19 or something. I'm not sure. But yeah, I mean, to get a wide receiver who not only can just short of 1,000 yards, but also put up 8 touchdowns, and you're getting him at the bottom of the 9th. I mean, that's serious value for this guy. So yeah, Tyler Lockett all the way.
Yeah, well, we know someone who didn't disrespect him. It was my dad, who went for both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. He got both of them.
Yeah, that's an interesting decision. But
well, we all said, what an interesting decision, having 2 people from the same team. One of them can't and they both scored well every single week, to the point where he managed to trade one off for some decent running backs at one point in the season. So yeah, I mean, I looked at stuff like that, and I looked at Tyler Lockett, and I thought, you know what? When you talk about when he was drafted, of course, that's best value. And I think I've overlooked that, because I thought in my head he was drafted earlier than that. I thought he was taken. And when you look at the names, so in the other positions, there's always been a standout up there. And with this, I feel like the people that are up there in the wide receivers are the guys we thought were going to be up there. There's 2 names for me that I didn't think were going to be that high. Christian Kirk was one of them. You've mentioned him already. I thought value. He was sort of early 7th round. So again, I feel like you're right over me with that. If Tyler Lockett was after him, then easily was better value than Christian Kirk, I think. I actually went for down the lines of saying Amari Cooper. I thought he was the disrespected guy. I think every year people are worried about him and steer away from him, and he drops further and further down the list of when he's going to get drafted. So I put those 2, but I feel like I've got to agree with you. I feel like I've got to go back on my notes. And I've overlooked him and disrespected him in this category after the draft as well. So yeah, Amari Cooper, where he finished.
Yeah, so Amari Cooper was the wide receiver 30 in most people's drafts and finished as the wide receiver 8. So I mean, I feel like we're kind of on similar lines, really. He had 9 touchdowns, 1,109 yards. So yeah, he got you an average of 10.2 points a game, whereas for Lockett was a bit lower at 9.5. I think I suppose it depends, like you say, it depends where you're taking them. Like I say, Cooper, 73 was the overall number mainly for Cooper. So that's probably the beginning of the 7th. So it's kind of similar to sort of Christian Kirk, Devonta Smith, that sort of area. So, yeah, I mean, definitely a value. I think a lot of people were pretty scared of Cooper at the beginning. Deshaun Watson not being able to play, had Jacoby Brissett, wasn't it, who was there. So, yeah, it's, it turned out pretty well, really, you have to say.
I thought he's fairly consistent as well. I think when I look through his week-on weeks, there wasn't overly that many weeks where he just didn't show up at all, and there wasn't a stretch of weeks where he was just quiet. Might have been the odd game in there, so he's quite consistent for me throughout the year. So I just thought that's what made him a bit of a value to me. So yeah, some different names for once from us. That's Christian Kirk, we're both knocked in there. But Adam, biggest surprise for you? Who have you locked in at the biggest surprise?
So for me on this one, I looked at like kind of similar for the best value. I was looking at the sort of the top, who's actually done pretty well. And to me, in the top 20, there was one guy who stood out like a sore thumb sort of thing, where I was just like, I just didn't think that he would get there. And I do think that it is partly due to who his quarterback was meant to be at the beginning of the season, was why I didn't think he would get there. And that was Brandon Ayuk. I wasn't really expecting that much from Ayuk. I kind of felt like he was someone who he did well with Jimmy G, but with Trey Lance, like, you kind of felt like it probably wasn't going to happen, and there's going to be a lot more running of the ball. Obviously, Debo as well. You got George Kittle, so you got quite a few options around him. I didn't really think that Brandon Ayuk would be someone that you would be saying would be the number 13 wide receiver at the end of the season. So I kind of felt, to me, that he was quite a big surprise. Obviously, Debo missed time. Trey Lance went out injured. Jimmy G came in for quite a bit of it. And then obviously now Brock Purdy. And he has dipped off a bit since Brock Purdy's come in, but he's still been pretty relevant. So, he was drafted as the wide receiver 39, which, to be honest, is kind of where I thought he would have ended up, that sort of mark. Finished 13th and 956 yards and 8 touchdowns. Them touchdowns felt quite high as well. I just didn't really see him getting 8 touchdowns this season. So for me, I felt like he was the kind of obvious one in the top bit of someone who I just didn't expect him to be there.
Is that the only name you've got locked into this position?
I mean, I've got one other, but then I kind of felt a little bit like I want him. He's in another one.
Save him for later.
And he's more relevant for the other one because he wasn't really much of a surprise because I didn't really know that much about him anyway. So
yeah. So prior to the show, I did tell you, Adam, I've got one of my awards on here where I couldn't put a name in. It was biggest surprise because before the season started, you may remember, you may not, I was quite hot on Brandon Ayuk, and I thought that he was going to have a bit of a breakout year this year. I thought this might be his year to have a bit of a breakout and be a bit more consistent and see a bit more of the ball. So when I'm looking through the list and seeing who did, it didn't shock me where he was. So, and it has you because obviously you weren't as hot on him as I was before the season. So maybe that's why I've overlooked him. But I went through the list and I wasn't shocked by anybody at all in maybe Zay Jones for me is the biggest surprise to see him on the list. When you look at the people below him of Lazard, Mike Williams, Jacoby Myers, Curtis Samuel, Adam Thielen, Juju Smith-Schuster, I probably wouldn't have pegged him to be finished the season above them. But yeah, I didn't think there was many really, all the other categories of quarterback and running back. We've had someone you've gone, they shouldn't have been in there. I feel like there wasn't anybody like that for the wide receivers where I was like, they shouldn't have been up there. Maybe like I say, Zay Jones, but there was a lot of people that were saying before the season started they like the look of Zay Jones and like the move there. So I don't know. I really struggle with that position.
I mean, that to me, just looking at it now, there is one other guy who I must admit I kind of thought he had an awful season. And the way it was reported was that it was an awful season and the offense was really struggling, which we all knew that the offense was really struggling. I was a little surprised to see Mike Evans at 11. Like all we were being told all the time was how bad it was. He wasn't getting many touchdowns. It wasn't really happening for Mike Evans. He still had over 1,100 yards. He only had 6 touchdowns, so it is the lowest in that sort of bracket until you end up getting towards the sort of 20 mark and stuff like that. But yeah, maybe him you could argue is surprising that he finished as high as what he did. But yeah, there's not many. It kind of feels like you could reason it for most. It's like, you look at people like DK Metcalf and he finished 19th and you think, that's a bit low for DK Metcalf. Yeah. But then you think, but it's Geno Smith, and you kind of thought that would probably what would happen. Maybe Tyler Lockett again.
I mean, I suppose one of them you could say you don't think it's a surprise. I don't think it's a surprise, but Amon-Ra St. Brown to be in the mix with all of the massive names might be an overachievement. I think is that maybe a bit harsh on him because of how well he did do last year, but we didn't know whether he'd replicate it.
Yeah, I don't think we felt that the Lions' offense was going to be quite as good as what it was. So maybe that, in that respect, you could go for Amon-Ra. But yeah, I mean, he's clearly a very, very good wide receiver. It's just that we didn't really expect Goff to be quite as good as what he was, and the whole offense to be quite as good as what it was for fantasy anyway.
Now they're the champions, as always. There's got to be a disappointment. There's got to be someone who didn't live up to expectation. I feel like there's probably a lot of people for this category. I guess you could have literally thrown a dart at the board and gone, yeah, that fits. But Adam, for you, who was the biggest disappointment?
So, like you say, there are a few. Obviously, because of injury, Cooper Kupp, he was the wide receiver number 1, finished 20, but it's a bit harsh because he missed a lot of games. Jamar Chase, I think anyone who drafted Jamar Chase as wide receiver 3, I mean, you're talking about first round picks here. Finished the wide receiver 16, not great. So that as well. But then he missed quite a few games because of injury in the middle of the season. So that's why. To me, there were 2 obvious ones who one played 15 games, the other played 16 games. So I kind of feel like these are the ones that you feel should be considered, like they've played most of the season as well. Cortland Sutton, I think, is definitely one that should be put in there.
Hang on, you say biggest disappointment, but you go back to our draft night of our show, and when Freddie picked him, the whole room erupted and was like laughing and wetting themselves that he was even picked him. So you say biggest disappointment. None of us were picking him. We were steering away from him. But yeah, he should have done better.
Yeah, I mean, he was drafted as though he was the wide receiver 16, which was in sort of the 4th round, finished 46th, 796 yards. So he didn't have bad yards, but only 1 touchdown. That was the problem. And he played in 15 games. That was the other thing. I was a little surprised it was that high. That's one that I kind of feel like was probably a big disappointment for a lot of people. But I feel like my main disappointment, and you might have gone down the same lines here, is Michael Pittman. I think Pittman is one that he was drafted as the wide receiver 11 in the 3rd round. A lot of people were thinking an awful lot of things were going to happen with Pittman this year. Finished as the wide receiver 32, and he had 895 yards, 3 touchdowns, averaged 7.2 points a game, and played in 16 games. That was the thing. And, as we know, the whole offense just really struggled for the Colts. I would probably say Pittman is what I would consider the biggest disappointment, just purely from where you drafted him. I think for most people in a draft, I know certainly in our league, it's running back heavy at the beginning. I think if you're talking about a wide receiver in the 3rd round, that's your wide receiver 1. And that's the difference. I don't think Cortland Sutton was anybody's wide receiver 1. or I'd hope not. But I think Michael Pittman was, and I think the expectation was that he was going to be a wide receiver one, and it just didn't happen.
If you can scroll back and go through the archives of some of the guys out there that really give you good like fantasy advice online, that write the articles and all of that, there was a guy that was being heavily touted to have a bit of a year this year and was up there within the conversation of to be drafted as the top 20 wide receiver. Now, this guy only played 11 games, but in the 11 games that he played, he was awful. And for me, it was Darnell Mooney. A lot of people before the season had him above T. Higgins and Pittman and all of them, saying, you know, he's the only person at the Bears worth looking at. He's everyone's saying how good and how talented he was, and he was going to be back to fine form, and this was going to be his year, and he was going to be absolutely fantastic. He was awful. Like, in the 11 games he played, he was awful. And I feel like he went fairly early in our league as well. I think he was.
Yeah, so looking at it, he on average went wide receiver 28. You're looking at a sort of in between the sort of back end of the 5th, early 6th round. So very high. It's a tough one, isn't it? Because he finishes the wide receiver 71. I mean, if he's only played 11 games.
Yeah, but
that's
he got injured later on. So I think he did play in the early part of the season and scored like 2 points, 3 points, no points, you know, sort of during the early part of the season. It was later on he got injured, wasn't it? It wasn't at the start of the season. So I don't know if you've got the breakdown in front of you.
But yeah, I can get it. So
he only averaged 5 points a game, didn't he?
That's generous. So he basically played in the first 11 weeks, and then he didn't play after that. So yeah, it wasn't great. I suppose the problem is with Mooney, maybe we should have seen this potentially coming, because obviously you've got a heavy rushing quarterback in Justin Fields. They wanted to play a certain way, didn't they, at the beginning? It didn't really work, and then they changed to Fields' way essentially, and that was what happened. So yeah, that's the problem with Mooney. Yeah, I can get it. I understand it. He averaged 5.6 points per game.
Yeah,
it's tough when obviously he's only played 11 games. It's a little bit like Cooper Kupp in a way, but obviously at a much sort of worse scale. But then he wasn't your number one pick, so yeah, I can see where you're coming from with Mooney. Yeah.
Adam, something that was a bit of a good year for them. I think there was a lot of standouts in this category. Who was your best rookie?
So, rookie-wise, it's weird actually, because, like you say, there was quite a few. But when I went back and looked at the stats and just going through everything, to me it felt like there was one that was quite glaringly obvious. And
it best be the same name I've got down on mine. It best
probably, yeah. Probably, because, you know, obviously he is an ex-Ohio State alum and all that. So Garrett Wilson.
Oh, not the same name.
Not the same. Oh, you went for Olave. Okay. To me, Wilson stood out, and I think the reason that Wilson stood out for me is he had the most yards of just over 1,000 yards. He only had 4 touchdowns, but a lot of the rookies actually didn't have that many touchdowns when you look at it. He pretty much played throughout the whole season. And this was the other thing. The one thing that I think was surprising, and maybe this is, I've put a little bit too much into this side of it, but Olave was drafted as the wide receiver 43, and Treylon Burks was drafted as 44. George Pickens was 46. Guy Moore was 49. Garrett Wilson was drafted 53. So he was like the 11th round and finished as the highest rookie wide receiver at 21. And I just feel like the stats kind of show that he probably had the best season by quite a long way. And the other thing is, you know, you're dealing with the Jets here, who offensively are not brilliant. Even still, they're not great. We kind of felt like they were going to be a run-heavy team who were going to put most of it through not Etienne, who was Brees Hall, put most of it through Brees Hall, and that would be it, sort of thing. So it's kind of, in a way, a little bit surprising as well. But yeah, I felt like Wilson did the best in a setup where I just don't feel like it was as easy to do as well as what, to me, I would rather have Jameis Winston or Andy Dalton throwing the ball than Zach Wilson. And so I just kind of feel like with Olave, I feel like he had a slightly better situation there.
Yeah, we're not talking about surprise here, though. We're talking about which one did the best. And you're right.
That's Garrett Wilson.
You're right with what you're saying in the terms of, we always knew that Olave, especially with Michael Thomas not being there at the start of the season, we always knew that Olave was probably going to be wide receiver 1, 2 at a push before the season started. So there's going to be people going, that Saints team aren't going to be awful. They've got to throw it to someone. Olave. We said it with Drake London as well. We went, Drake London's going to go there as wide receiver 1. So I feel like these were why they were drafted before. And I remember in the draft room when we were talking about this, before the season started, the Jets had Garrett Wilson listed as wide receiver 4 on their depth chart, which is why I think a lot of people were put off to drafting him earlier when talent-wise, for me anyway, should have been one of the first off the board, despite the fact it was the Jets. You take the gamble. He's that good. So I feel like that's why he was drafted so much later. But when you break it down into week on week for me, and you say Garrett Wilson was the best, let me just talk you through week on week of Olave. Week 1, he struggled. He only had 9.1 points. Then he had 11, 23, 16, 15. Then he didn't play. Then 17, 10, 13, 7, 24, 11, and 10. I just feel that level of consistency from a rookie, for me, what is it? 2 down weeks, and one of them was week 1 a push. For me, that just felt like the best for fantasy.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. I feel like, I suppose because obviously he has got a slightly higher points per game ratio compared to what Wilson has.
Wilson took ages to get going, didn't he? He didn't come, and when Zach Wilson was quarterback, he disappeared completely.
Yeah, so he had 22 points in week 2, but that was literally the rest of it you're talking about single digit, not nothing major until you start getting to week 8. And then week 12 through to week 14, so 12, 13, 14, it's not too bad. 15 was okay. It's difficult when you're a rookie. It's tough when you start going through these sort of things, because obviously, you're talking about an 11th round pick with Wilson, Olave, 10th round pick. It's kind of similar. It's like you're not expecting big points from these guys. My only thing is, because of that, to me, I'd probably rather have a rookie who has the potential to go a bit more boom or bust, because he's going to be your flex play. If you're taking him in round of 10 or 11, I don't know, say you've got 3 running backs, a quarterback, a tight end, so that's 4. Well, you've got 5 more rounds. Chances are most of these guys are going to be. So you're probably looking at your wide receiver 4 or 5, maybe, that kind of, if you're going down that route, probably wide receiver 4. Yeah, like I say, he's going to be a bench play. He's going to be that. He's kind of someone that you're only going to play him if you're going up against some poor opposition that he's got a good chance of getting points. And you look at where his boom ones were with Wilson, Chicago, Minnesota. Not really a shocker, I suppose. It's like it's teams that can't defend, isn't it? Really. So I think that's the problem. I suppose if you want, like you say, if you want someone with more consistency, then you would go for Olave. But I just feel like in that position, they're the sort of guys that you sort of try and grab someone who's going to do something great for you. But yeah, I just think that both of them have been great. I mean, obviously, and both of them are head and shoulders above everyone else, which, you know, it's a factory, isn't it, in Ohio State? So it's not really a shocker.
Yeah, we already know that the next 2 years, this year in the draft, they've got a great name coming out. It's going to be a first rounder. And then 2024, they're going to have the wide receiver 1 coming out of that college again with Marvin Harrison Jr. So it is literally a factory, isn't it? It's just unbelievable, the talent of wide receiver that comes from there. It's going to be the same conversation as well. I think they're going to be having when they're looking to dish out offensive rookie of the year. It's going to be consistency over production again. And obviously, as we both said, in both of these categories, Garrett Wilson tops Olave on that topic. So I think that's where we're going to go now. Best waiver wire target. Before we get into it, he was in our league. I think the name that you're plucking out there, he wasn't on the waivers at the start of the year. Someone took him. So who are your best waiver wire targets?
So I've got 2.
I've got 2.
I've got 2 that I think are kind of the sort of guys that you should be looking at. I feel like I have to mention Donovan Peoples-Jones. I think he did very well. He was the wide receiver 81. He wasn't drafted in a lot of leagues. Finished as the wide receiver 37, 797 yards and 3 touchdowns. I think he was pretty consistent, Donovan's Peoples-Jones. I mean, he wasn't anything amazing, which obviously, you know, is a waiver wire pickup. He's not someone that you would expect to be amazing, but he did have a few weeks where he actually did perform quite well and looked all right. So I do feel like I should mention him. Zay Jones.
Oh,
he's the one that I think he was way on the waiver wire with us. He was the wide receiver. Sorry?
Unless Johnny took him.
Yeah, I think he was. I'm not sure if he did.
I've got a feeling in our league, Zay Jones went quite early because didn't someone try and take Marvin Jones and took Zay Jones and by accident?
That sounds like something that would have happened. Yeah. No, I thought he obviously did really well. Was the wide receiver 92 when it comes to being drafted, which basically meant he wasn't drafted. And he finished as the wide receiver 26 with 802 yards and 5 touchdowns. Real lease of life at Jacksonville. I've not really seen anything from him at all. Certainly not fantasy wise. And I mean, to finish as wide receiver 26, okay, you're just outside the sort of wide receiver 2 bracket. But if it's someone that you're picking up for nothing, then, you know, that's pretty good and pretty consistent from a guy. You know, he averaged 7.6 points a game. Not amazing, but, you know, he was free, so it's not bad. Really liked him. Thought he did really well, and that's why he was probably the best waiver wire one. Who did you think I was going to pick?
Oh, I thought you were going to say Christian Watson. I thought.
Oh, okay.
I know that I had him and I drafted him, and I thought the production value that we got from him at the, week 10 onwards, I thought we were going to get that straight out the gate. I thought he was going to be really explosive for the Packers, and I took him in the draft and thought, yeah, I've got a good one there. Struggled with drops, then injuries, and then I just couldn't have a space for him because he didn't go on IR. So I ended up having to drop him, and when he became viable enough to pick up, you sneaked in there, and then he just went on an absolute stormer from week 10 onwards, didn't he? So I felt like that was won most people their leagues or got them into the playoffs towards that back end of the business end from week 10 onwards was just insane. And the other one for me was Isaiah Hodgins, who definitely wasn't drafted in anybody's league because he wasn't even on the Giants team at the start of the year. So I felt like week 13 onwards, he really had some good scores, productive. He was definitely on the waiver wire. He was back in that business end when you were looking to push for the playoffs, push for your championship. So So I looked in those two as waiver wire targets.
Yeah, I can't even find Isaiah Hodgins on here.
Well, he didn't play till later on, so I don't know whether you're gonna probably about in the ninth. What are you looking for? Where he finished for the season?
No, I'm looking for where he where on the drafted section. I don't think he. Yeah, but he's not. I don't think he's even in the list.
Is that because he didn't start with the Giants?
No. Well, it doesn't matter if he's moved. No, he's not there at all. He's not around. No, Isaiah Hodgins. Where did Isaiah Hodgins finish this year then? Okay, so he finished as the wide receiver 69, four touchdowns, 392 yards. Like you say, he didn't play most of the season. He played in 10 games, but obviously, yeah, it was kind of week 10 onwards with the Giants was when it kind of really kicked off, and he looked pretty good. And yeah, no, did really well. Would have been a great waiver wire pickup, especially if you picked him up in week 13 or for week 13, as he had two touchdowns 2 weeks in a row, one off, and then two more touchdowns at the end. So
it finished really strong. Like I said, it's the business end of fantasy, and for me, I just valued them as waiver wire targets at the business end, so that's why I went for them. Now the big award, the Big E, Adam. Surely we've got the same name.
I don't.
We disagreed on this for quarterback and for running back. So we're going to disagree again?
Yeah, I think we are, because it's very difficult to get away from Justin Jefferson. Very difficult. However, I have, because this guy is my MVP, even if he's not, because a lot of people are going to go, obviously it's Justin Jefferson. I'm going to go for Tyreek Hill. Now, the reason I'm going to go for Tyreek Hill on this one is when you actually look at it purely from a stats point of view, he had about 80 yards less than Jefferson, and he had one touchdown less than Jefferson. That was it. But the reason that I'm going to go for Hill is, firstly, it's a brand new team that he went into. He had never played with any of them guys before that were on the offense, from what I know of. And the amount of quarterback change that happened in Miami this season was insane. With Tua playing, I think I read, Tua played 13 games, but you've got to remember, obviously, like at least 2 of them were when he came out. So, I mean, they weren't full games for some of them. Teddy Bridgewater didn't really do much. He didn't play a lot because he
didn't complete games either.
Well, whenever he got into the team, he got injured. So obviously he was dealing with a third choice quarterback at times, which I know, Brock Purdy, it's worked out really well. Not so great in Miami. But yeah, I just feel if you throw all of them things in together, I just feel like he's someone who did very well. The other thing was he was drafted at the back of the second round. He was the wide receiver 8, finished as the wide receiver 3, whereas for obviously Jefferson, I think, was the wide receiver 2 behind Cooper Kupp. So we all kind of expected him to be right at the top. I just felt like Tyreek had a really strong year. There's only 1 point difference in points per game between him and Jefferson. I hope you're going to say Jefferson, given the amount that I've mentioned and compared him against Jefferson. So yeah, that was kind of why I went for Hill. I get it's not the conventional choice, but that was where I went.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with you on a lot of aspects of it. And also, before the season started, we all thought Waddle was going to be great as well, which he was. Whereas Minnesota, we knew that Thielen would have a part, but we thought it's Jefferson, isn't it? And just Jefferson. Yeah. Whereas we knew there'd be a bit of share for Tyreek. Not fancy knocking in Devontae Adams' name into that, you know.
So, yeah, do you know
above
what?
Tyreek, didn't he?
So when I put Tyreek Hill down for this and went through everything, and then I went, bugger off, kind of said everything the same for Devontae Adams. The only difference I think with Hill is the constant changing of the quarterback is the difference with Hill, whereas for Devontae Adams had Carr all the way through. Yeah,
Well,
Devontae Adams had
he had Stiddy for a little bit.
I mean, like the last couple of weeks, wasn't it? So yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the reason that I stuck with Hill, just because of that. Yeah, Devontae Adams was just touchdowns, wasn't it? Just like, I think he had 14 touchdowns, so had double the touchdowns of Hill. Had over 200 yards less than Hill, which is a bit of a surprise. But yeah, Adams was great as well, but I just think having your quarterback changing on you that much is a big thing.
I only brought it up to wind you up a little bit to stir
Yeah,
the
yeah, of
pot
course
of the
you did.
Packers fan. But no, yeah, I put Justin Jefferson. I thought it was just an easy one. When you look at in terms of points in our league, especially, I know we've got a couple of bonus points in there and stuff. The only people who finished above him were Josh Allen, Mahomes, and Hurts. And when you think about that and the value of then, it's a wide receiver. That value is just ridiculous, isn't it? Finished with the most average points per game. You know, number one wide receiver, probably the MVP of the season for offense in real life. So why not give it to him in fantasy as well? So yeah, I think there was only I'll give you some positive news. There was only 3 teams that stopped him all year, wasn't there? 3 teams out of 17 games. All the rest, he was absolutely insane. And one of those teams was obviously the Green Bay Packers. So,
do you think he'll be the number one next season? Because, like, when it comes to being drafted, because obviously it feels like at the moment he's the obvious number one. But obviously Cooper Kupp will be coming back, and in theory, he should be fit. You look at Chase again in these playoffs, just looking amazing. Obviously, Devontae Adams having another good season. Does it feel like Jefferson is the obvious?
To me, yeah. I think you'll always have the worry that Kupp might now get injured a bit, and the Rams didn't look particularly great. We have always said, although he's managed to do it, there is quite a few mouths to feed at the Rams where there's not at the Vikings. And then the other teams where you're looking at, obviously, Jamar Chase with T. Higgins, there's a bit of share. Tyreek Hill and Waddle, there's a bit of share. So Justin Jefferson's he's the real deal, isn't he? He's a real deal. He's done it 2 years on the bounce now of proving how good he is. So I don't see why we won't be picking him first, and I don't see why he wouldn't. I think he's a round one coming off the board before a lot of the running backs as well. I think we'll see Christian McCaffrey, likes of that maybe go, but I think people are jumping on the bandwagon of that change now to get, because if you get Jefferson, Adams, Hill, Brown, Diggs, Lamb, they're all the names that every single year they're insane. There's no drop off. So if you get one of them in fantasy, you guaranteed the points every week. Whereas we've said the running backs this year, if you started talking about Cook, Kamara, Henry, they won't Chubb. They don't finish at the top of the category every single year. Sometimes they drop. So I feel like you're going to see a turn and see people moving down for the likes of Jefferson as a round one pick now.
Yeah, I feel. I still feel I think there's 4 running backs, and I mean, 3. There's 3 running backs. Obviously, we didn't see Josh Jacobs coming in the way that he did. I think Eckler, McCaffrey, and Henry are probably the 3. I don't know so much. I feel like Jonathan Taylor will probably end up being put into that that sort of category as well come next season. So I think, but if you actually look at it, you've got Jacobs, Eckler, McCaffrey, Henry. They were the 4 that scored above Justin Jefferson, and then it doesn't take a lot. I mean, you have Nick Chubb, Saquon Barkley, Tony Pollard, and then the rest are all under 200 points for the season. And when you look at these wide receivers, and like we were saying, we feel like it has changed a little bit with the wide receivers. Because bear in mind, you would expect like running backs, especially in our league, you might get like 2 or 3 wide receivers in the first round. So the first 12, first 14 picks. AJ Brown, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, Justin Jefferson, they all had more points. That they all were over 200. So it feels like it's starting to turn a little bit.
There's no gamble with them either. Before the season started, if I said to you, name the top 5 wide receivers for fantasy points wise, they are the names you'd pick. Whereas the running backs, if I said name, 2 of them or 3 of them might not make that top 5, and then you're like I think that's where we're really going to see the big change. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
That's our wide receivers. That's it done. Are we coming back? Are we treating the tight ends to a tight end show? Are we getting on board with that? Or
I think we should. I think there are certainly some that I know a lot of people go, it's just Kelsey, because it kind of is just Kelsey. But I think that there are a few there. So we will do a tight end one. It might be a little bit shorter, as there might not be quite so much to chat about.
Yeah, shorter, and then really giving people that advice of which ones to look at. I think next year, I think there'll be some names that have improved or did well at the back end of the year and not so necessarily at the start, that we can really guide you into looking at them for next year. I think that's probably because I think it'll be a big point, because like you said, if you did, usually you don't get Kittle, Andrews, or Kelsey. Pick a new one up every week. You'll be fine. It doesn't really matter. So yeah, I think that's the right angle. We are back a bit earlier than expected. We're back on tomorrow for a preview for the betting for this weekend. Looking forward to that. Adam, you already started looking at the odds and started having a little bit of a pick now.
I've got to at some point. I haven't done it yet, but yeah, I will have a look. So don't worry, we'll have plenty of bets for you.
Yeah, so we'll be back with some bet builders. Obviously, 888 Sport have got their fantastic offer on, which I have jumped on and managed to have a little bit of a dabble on a bit of their bet builders. And obviously, they're giving their money back up to £20 on a losing bet builders as a free bet and betting credits. So we'll be building some of them for you and having a look at the odds tomorrow. Until then, guys, thanks for joining, and see you tomorrow.